All right, welcome to today's episode of Words of the Wise. I have Chief Bauer from Wyoming PD in Minnesota. He has 25 years in law enforcement, and I'm really excited to have a conversation. So, welcome to the show, Chief Bauer. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. Thanks for having me. It's a really cool topic to share information about, and I'm excited to get started.
I am too, and I know that you're a fan of holistic wellness, and I would love to kind of touch on those a little bit later. But for anyone who
Sure.
doesn't know who you are, if you could give maybe a little bit of background on you.
Yeah, sure. So professionally, I've been in law enforcement for just over 25 years. I started in a suburb of St. Paul, Woodbury. Worked there for 21 years. My wife and I both worked at Woodbury, which locked us both into kind of the position we were in as sergeants. Um, So I started looking elsewhere just to find another opportunity. I took this spot in the city of Wyoming, which is a city of about 8,200 people. We are authorized for 10 officers, and we have, reserves and full-time staff as well that are not sworn. Um, my education background, I went back to school. Let's see, I finished up in 2019, but I actually went back to school and got my doctorate in organization development and change. That was a really cool experience working with people that were not in law enforcement, and really broadening kind of my background and my experiences along the way. So that was a really awesome experience for me to work through that. Um, Personal life, I mentioned, my wife's in law enforcement as well. She just actually had 10 years as a canine handler, and I had to put her dog down recently. So she
Mm.
is no longer in that role, but after 10 years in that role, it's very clear she's much cooler than me. And so I have three daughters as well, from 7 years old, 10 years old, and 19 was my daughter's birthday this weekend. Um, so we stay busy with all of that, but that's kind of my background.
That's amazing. And I'm really interested because you didn't tell me when we talked offline that you had a spouse in law enforcement, and I'm really interested to
Yeah.
hear how was that dynamic in the context of wellness? Because we know we hear a lot of like home life balance and, being able to shut it off when you're at home. How did you two, manage that over the years of both coming from the same profession?
Yeah. She was a paramedic for several years, trying to get in law enforcement. And being a medic is a whole different world as well. I mean, it's also very stressful, very uh, a lot of traumatic experiences along the way. But I think us both being in law enforcement really gives us a different perspective. Um, Working in the same department was difficult because then it's really, you know, you're all of the, it's really difficult to separate work from home.
Right.
Um, but honestly, we uh, still talk shop, but it's different. We have a good way of trying to compartmentalize it, but we really do and understand where each are coming from that way. So I think it's a benefit for us. If there's something that does come up, I mean, I think we process things similarly. We're not coming from really different operating systems as far as how we process calls or incidents. You know, she's uh, she's been involved in critical incidents. She was involved in an officer involved shooting as well. And working through that early on in our relationship was, um, those incidents are stressful. It's always challenging. And, right away in the beginning of our marriage when that happened, it was, that's it. I think it was helpful for us to both be in law enforcement to be able to support, I could support her in a different way and have some understanding. Um, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I think that's exactly what I wrote down is like having the same level of understanding. I think one of the things that I hear about a lot is like, how can you educate your spouse who's not in law enforcement to
Yeah.
be able to empathize and maybe not understand the full extent, but understand that you may need, certain things when it comes with or comes to coping or, stress management. And so it seems to me like I'm sure there's its own unique challenges of having two people in law enforcement, but at least the level of understanding of
Right.
what you're going through is a part of that foundation.
Yeah, there's it's interesting. She called me the other day after doing some search warrants, and um I'll spare you the details of all of it for everyone, but it's just an interesting dynamic of going from this search warrant, seeing things that most people would never even imagine are possible or out there, and then leaving work and going to pick up your daughter at soccer and having conversations there with other parents, and it's a really interesting um, career choice, honestly, that you go from these things that we're sitting there, having conversations while she's driving there and laughing about the how are we, we're in a really unique situation that we see these things and experience these things and then, be able to honestly laugh about some of it. And I don't mean that now, this was not a traumatic type type of situation, but seeing some of the things that we do and then flip a switch and you have to be parent, dealing with the dramas of a 10-year-old and all of that and not have that impact because it's not your daughter's fault that you're involved in this and that you want to make sure that you're being respectful of them as well. So it's interesting. We laugh a lot. The humor is always a really good um, diversion or a way to kind of diffuse this stuff and we laugh a ton about this about what we see and you have to. That's part of the deal.
Yeah, and I think that that's healthy, to a certain extent to be able to like find the humor in maybe some of the like challenging things. And we also know that law
Yeah.
enforcement has a lot of dark humor and it's a part of like the coping
Yeah.
mechanism of it, which I think is positive in a way for sure. And it sounds to me like what you did was you still had work-life balance,
Mhm.
but it was in the context of shutting it off for your kids, and being able
Yes.
to like
Right.
be present for your kids. So you two are experiencing maybe not the same things, but similar things. And you have that level of understanding together as being two individuals in law enforcement. But then the balance comes from being able to be like, okay, it's time for soccer and let's be
Yep.
like present and available for our kids when we can. So I love that. I think
Yeah.
it's really cool. And again, we didn't talk about that offline. So I was like, oh, interesting. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. But I know that, obviously 25 years ago, wellness was totally different and it looked totally
Yeah. Very
different.
much.
And I would love to hear like what has been your experience with wellness and the progression of wellness over the years, and maybe how has your perception changed over that time?
Yeah. And I think it has been a really noticeable change just in people's perception. I, you know, I have kind of two situations that are kind of in my mind. Working a night shift with really active, very proactive group, and working with one of the officers that was, very engaged. Hearing him talk at over break one night, it was 3 in the morning. We're having dinner together, and hearing him tell about his experiences unprompted. I didn't even ask, but hearing him talk about his experience working through art, the therapy to work through PTSD symptoms, and hearing him talk about the success of it and how it was almost talked about like it was a cool thing that he was able to do this and how effective it was. And just watching from, I was not involved in the conversation, but watching how he was telling his coworkers how effective it um, was really uh, a, a marked experience just to see that we've made changes. Things have changed. Things are better. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, and I'm not saying that it's organizationally that's consistent across every organization, but as a profession, I think we've come a long way, and that was probably 6, 7 years ago when that happened. And that was after some definite changes versus hearing people that were involved in officer involved shootings in 2010, 2012 in that arena. I remember that they were people that I had worked with that were unwilling or didn't want to go see a mental health professional because of the stigma attached to it. They didn't want to go because they would have to pay cash for it, that they didn't want to go through insurance because insurance wasn't going to cover them for the therapy because they need to have a diagnosis in order for the therapy to be covered. And they didn't want to absorb that cost, and they didn't want to um, take that on to be able to that if they their perception was that if I ever try to get a job somewhere else, I'm going to have to disclose that I have a mental illness.
Mm.
And that's not that long ago. That's 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, and that was people would refuse to go to therapy to deal with significantly, firsthand trauma that they wouldn't go because of that hurdle. Whereas, the departments are doing incredible things now with paid therapy, all kinds of different options. EAP back in the day was, has been available, but having therapists that are specifically trained for public safety. And so they can better understand some of the humor and some of the differences involved with dealing with people in public safety. And there's just that kind of there's that barrier for if I'm going to go talk to a therapist and they just don't understand the line of work. It doesn't mean that they had to be doing it, but having them specialize in public safety, I think is a big thing. And many departments, including our department, have started doing annual checkup from the neck up, or whatever you want to call it, a check-in.
Mhm.
And we mandate it through policy that every sworn officer has to go see this mental health therapist once a year. It's 45 minutes to an hour. I don't care what they talk about. That's not, important. It's that they're building a relationship. They can talk about whatever they choose, but the idea is there that we get in a routine of seeing someone once a year and checking in and being able to say, um, if something does come up where I'm not sure what to do with this, I've got a person that I know that I've at least met face to face or had some conversation with that I can reach out to. So I think we've made significant headways with how we culturally address mental health and wellness as a whole. I think it's um, there's still room to grow. And, I teach for the BCA, the state police agency, the investigative agency. They do a ton of training, and I teach mentoring and coaching across the state. And, I it's still not consistent across the board. When I ask what are the wellness initiatives that you have in place, because that is part of coaching and mentoring, being able to recognize when someone might be experiencing I play a couple of videos of an officer that it was a less than desirable traffic stop with how they interacted with this person. And one of them is pretty extreme. And we talk through it like, okay, you get this complaint after the words, what is going through your head? How do you, as a supervisor, what do you recognize as what could be a cause? Ultimately, from a put your HR hat on. It doesn't matter what the cause is. Technically, it's unacceptable behavior either way. However, from a human side of things, we want to be receptive to understanding that people are bringing everything, they show up to work with a whole trailer full of stuff behind them. It's what's going on in their families. It could be financial stress. It could be, stuff that, illness in their families, a million different things. And to say that you're just going to leave that at home is not realistic. It doesn't mean that acting out or, creating conflict in the workplace is acceptable. It just gives us a better context as someone that we're coaching or mentoring to say, okay, what contributed to this? This is very atypical for them.
Yeah.
Um, versus if this is the first traffic stop they've gone on after, administrative leave after they were on, or I'm sorry, after an officer involved shooting, and this is their first traffic stop, and they're highly on edge and confrontational. It's like, okay, what does that tell us? Being aware of that context is important. Again, doesn't mean it's acceptable, but we want to be aware of what is potentially leading up to this, how do we address that, and what are the resources we have available to try and make sure that we can support them along the way.
There's so many things I want to unpack in what
I
you
know, I'm sorry.
said. No, I'm
You
really
get me started and I can flap my jaws for hours. Don't worry.
I
So yeah.
love it. No, I love it. And one, I think that one of the words that popped up for me is like having that empathy of like, yes, like this behavior wasn't correct.
Yeah.
But what led up to that? And like you said,
Mm,
then how can we get resources proactively to try to offload some of those things so that that doesn't happen again? Because
right.
it's usually there's something, right? It's like you're on your 10th hour and you're really
Mhm.
tired and you just dealt with five other calls that
Yep.
night that, cumulatively added up over that shift. Or maybe it's home issues and,
Hmm.
it's hard to be happy and, present and productive on the job when you're having work home stuff or financial
Right.
stuff or whatever it is. And so I like that you're sitting here saying like we're not excusing bad behavior, but what we are trying to do is get to the bottom of what are the causes of these things so that we can get in front of it and we can make sure that we have the resources available to help alleviate those things for the
Right.
future. Because
Right.
there's always going to be a reason why things happen, and having that empathy and understanding, I think, is huge. And I also really like that you said a couple things, like one, eliminating hurdles. I think that like for me, if you take a look at wellness as a whole, and you take a look at all of the excuses or the challenges to get resources, and you can say, okay, what are most people saying? And you said it in the context of EAP or therapy. If people are saying, hey, like I really don't resonate with this person because they
Yep.
have no
Right.
experience at all with law enforcement and I feel like I can't connect. How
Right.
can we eliminate that hurdle? Okay, how can we get some people who have experience working with public safety
Hmm.
in front of them? How can we get the quote unquote culturally competent people in front of them so that we eliminate that barrier or that hurdle? And then, if the other excuse I hear all the time is like, well, I don't have time. So then how
Hmm.
can we incorporate resources on duty? Or how can
Yeah.
we incorporate really quick and easy things that they can do before shift or after shift or at home? So I like the idea of, okay, how can we try to cut through some of those
Hmm.
things so that it's easy. It's one thing to have resources, but like how can we make those resources easier so that people actually take advantage of them? Because I think that's the next
Right.
is like, how do we get people to do it?
Yeah. And when we're looking at, what is our strategy that we're looking at with wellness? I think looking at strategy for wellness just is the same as what is the strategy of our outside facing, how do we address crime? How do we address problem properties? All that. You have to have a strategy in place. And in order to do that, whether it's mental health, whether it's, problem properties, any of those things, like what are we trying to accomplish? And then looking at it from what are the systems, what are the structures, what are the behaviors, and what is our culture that really feed into those things. Because if we don't address one of those things, it's going to fail. You're going to fail your strategy, or you're not going to achieve your strategy. And if department culture isn't supportive of that, no matter what you do, it's not going to be effective. Then it's left up to individuals. If there's systems in place that prevent that from happening, if we're not allowing people time to do mental health, therapy, if we're not overcoming some of those hurdles, like if I want insurance to pay for this, um, I have to be diagnosed with something, and it's by departments like ours, and I was not the innovator of this. There's other departments in the state that started this, but being able to compensate or pay people to go to therapy
Mm.
and also pay for those first 5 sessions. Every year we give every officer the ability to go see the therapist 5 times, and the department, I don't know who's using it. I just pay the bill. I just get a statement from the provider that we have an arrangement with, and it get you it gets used. And that's the cool part. I put it in place and we budget for 20% of your officers to use it. And we see uses of it. And it doesn't have to be work related. It can be family structure. It can be things in place at home that are preventing them from showing up and being their best self at work. And we, you know, I just get the bill and I pay it, and it's great. It's a really easy way to say you don't have to go through your insurance provider. You don't have to go to EAP, and they use just some random provider that signed up. I don't even know how they select EAP providers, and that, you know, doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it's just like if we can provide someone to you that is this is all they do. Maria Ridgway is the firm we use, and that's all they do is public safety, and started with law enforcement specifically. So it's uh, we have this arrangement with them, and I was fortunate to be able to get arranged with them to make this happen, and we're fortunate to be within geographic area to do that. And I'm not sure if that's consistent across the United States that there are public safety specific mental health professionals, but it's definitely an area that is um, has some opportunity, and I think there's definitely a place for it.
Yeah. I'm curious, are you seeing a difference in generations when it comes to being receptive and taking advantage of these things that are being offered? Like, I know
Hmm.
you said that you have some people who are like talking about the things that they're doing and they're saying, "Hey, like I do art therapy and it's really helping me." And are you seeing a divide where maybe one generation is more receptive than the other, or what does it look like for you guys?
Sure, and I think one of the situations that really was the point that made me more aware of this. This was back in my previous department, and we had um, a critical incident that involved a several juveniles that were ended up in a motor vehicle crash that was fatality, and it was a significant crash. And that the available technology and everyone monitors their kids with every movement they make through Find My Device or any of these other apps that they really know where their kids are at all times. It was one of the first ones that I had been on that we started getting family and friends showing up within minutes of this occurring. So, um, we have a relatively big scene that we're managing on top of now family and friends are showing up. So we can't, we don't have the opportunity to kind of collect ourselves and go do a notification at a home. It's like they're on scene while this is still unfolding. And, I remember getting done with that incident thinking, we really did an awesome job on that. And it was interesting because it was a really young crew. I had been working days for several years and decided I wanted to go back to working midnights. I really enjoy training and development, and going back and working with 22, 25-year-old brand new people. I absolutely loved it. It was, it reinvigorated me and was a really cool opportunity. Um, so this was all brand new cops, or relatively young cops that were on this incident. And I remember, like I said, I remember thinking we really knocked it out of the park on that. Yes, it wasn't a great incident, but we did really good job on it. And then the following shift, one of the officers had called in sick, and in kind of having more conversation with the people that were on that incident, learned that some were seeking, help from their families and going to talking to their faith leadership, or they were going to speak with a mental health therapist that we had on the arrangement with, and hearing their experiences caught me off guard.
Mm.
I remember it was just like this was a really big success, a success story for us to be able to work through this case so well, this incident. Um, but they were experiencing it very differently. And it just so happened to align with my annual checkup with the mental health professional. And I remember going to it saying, I don't know what to do with this. Like, this is very different. And I'm kind of confused about how to address it with them and how to support them. But also my concern about, this wasn't all that significant. It wasn't like it was, I don't mean to minimize it, but like, how do you work through these things? And you still have to come to work the next day. How do we build resilience along the way as well? That was my concern, that if I'm losing people off the street the next day after an incident, how do we develop resilience?
Mhm.
Um, and it was interesting because the therapist, her comment was, why don't you just ask them? what they need. And it was like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. That's one thing I could do, sure. But it also was a really interesting dynamic to say like they're owning it too. They're saying, I'm gonna go talk to somebody, and they're addressing it. They're not just, stuffing it or using, alcohol inappropriately or,
Um,
taking other ineffective stress resol ways of dealing with stress that doesn't that have been done for years, but it seemed like they were dealing with this in a much healthier way. And it was interesting to see. And I think there's definitely that's a culture change as well within the field. And I don't know that it's generational, other than I think that there's just a lot more awareness and there's a better um, it's talked about a lot more, and there's a different awareness about this type of stuff, that it's no longer a stigma attached to it, or we're trying to minimize that. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that there is that question, it's like it's so good that there's resources and that there are people who are starting to recognize after a critical incident, hey, like
Right.
this might affect me in the future. So what are the things that I can do now to process that and then recover and grow from it instead of, I think what maybe historically has been done, which is shove it down and don't deal with
Mm,
it. And then wait for it to maybe come back later and
right.
bite you or whatever unhealthy coping mechanisms have been used. But I
Right.
also think there's the question, and I've had, and I don't know the answer, and maybe you can give me your insights on this because there is that question of like, well, where's the line between like, yes, we have to be able to have the resources to deal with these things, but you also have to be able to continue on in the career and to do the job that you signed up for. And so I think there is that question of like resiliency and mental strength. And I think I've been asking this question a lot because it does look different for everybody. And I think
Hmm.
the question is like, well, what is the definition of resiliency? Like
Right.
what does that mean? What does that look like? And maybe if you could give your insights on that, and I could also share my insights on it, but I think that it's that question of like identifying, well, what does resiliency look like? And then how can we um, you know, create resources and like you said, a plan in place to be able to accomplish
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I don't know that I have the answer. I think I would probably have a book published if I did. But I think I mean, we know from the science behind this that the more frequently that you experience traumatic incidents, the more frequently that you are exposed to these things, and the more frequently that you have experiences in your entire life, whether it's work related or not, when they're not addressed or not dealt with appropriately, we know that they compound on each other. It's not just one off. It's not like separate buckets that these things sit in. It's
Right.
like we know that they compound on top of each other. And the uh, my sister is a clinical social worker, and hearing their awareness of this stuff is decades ahead of where we're at in law enforcement. And it's like the information's there. They the social worker, the clinical social worker sees the social worker for social workers. Like they have professionals that help work through this, and it's like we're decades behind in trying to figure out how to make this work. And it's like we can, you know, other professions have had to deal with this. Now they might not be directly targeted for traumatic incidents, being assaulted or being shot at and those type of things, but there's a foundation that we can use from other professions to try and do this. Um, I think that resilience might look different. Depending on the person, like you said. And I think that there's some people are just better equipped. And I know that seems like it's inherent and that might be, but I think there is something that's just how you process these things. There is some people are better suited
Mm.
to build in that resilience or have that resilience in place. Now, how do we create that resilience to make sure that people that are entering this line of work that are much more aware of it, that they can do this for 30 years? That's a great question. I don't know that we have the answer to that. It's how, if we're more aware of this, if people are seeking help earlier, if there's programs in place and things in place that are better able to, whether it's physical wellness, whether it's all these things that we know mitigate the impact of traumatic experiences, are they, what's the longitudinal kind of research to say that, yes, we're in a better spot because of this, and people are able to retire after 33 years and 35 years and are successful and they, are not, don't have a wake of destruction behind them as a result of not dealing with this stuff. I think some of that's to be determined still. I think we're doing some of the right things, but I think some of that still needs to be researched and determined is, are we there yet?
Yeah, no, I agree with you on it. I do think, and it's interesting because it's like human psychology, right? And like how
Hmm.
like different personalities are going to deal with different things in different ways. And there's people in my life that are so good at just being level and like not letting things
Hmm.
affect them. And then there are other people in my life that I know of that are just so emotional and so sensitive.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
that is a quality question of like how do we adapt to the different personality types to make sure that there's longevity not just in the career but in life and
Hmm.
life
Right.
after the career. But the thing that I have been taught and what I try to teach is that there's two ways to look at stress management and mental resiliency. So stress management is typically going to be more of a reactionary process, right?
Sure.
So you have a stressful event, a critical incident. What can we do after the fact to be able to manage those things, to be able to
Sure.
offload and recover from those things?
Yep.
Mental resiliency is more of that proactive measure. And I always try to teach it in a way of, physical and mental health being very, very similar. And I think the sooner we can start to really identify both of them as being like the same in sense of like recovery and building resiliency, I think a lot of that stigma will start to go away too.
Sure.
Because when you think about physical resiliency, like what do you think about when you think of physical resiliency? It's like, okay, the more I train my body and my muscles to be able to do hard things, the harder things I'm able to do, right?
Yeah. Right.
So
Yep. Makes
you
sense.
you start off kind of like maybe you don't work out and you don't have like the strong muscles, and so you don't feel
Right.
like you're very physically resilient. You're more likely to become injured over time. You're less likely to be able to handle really hard things because you're just not physically there, from a
Yeah.
resilience perspective. And so I like to think of mental resiliency kind of in the same way. It's like, maybe in the beginning you feel really weak mentally, like you don't have
Mhm.
those quote unquote muscles. Your brain's not a muscle, but it acts as a muscle. So in the sense that the more you train your brain to go through hard things, the more hard things you can go through, and then the less likely you are to become injured. And when we think of mental injuries in the same perspective of physical injuries, I think again, it kind of starts to break that stigma down of like, okay, well,
Right.
then how can we put in place things proactively that are going to help my brain to become stronger and to be able to withstand harder things? And then on the backside of it, when there is a traumatic event and you need those resources, how can we then offload those more reactively? So that's been the best way it's been explained to me
Yeah.
and how I try to think of that. And then, of course, there's then the action step of like, okay, how can we put those things into action to where you're actually doing it? Because proactivity is always going to be harder than reactivity. Um, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah.
that
That
makes
that
sense.
totally makes sense. Absolutely. I think it's connecting those two and creating that parallel between the physical. We know that physical wellness is relatively easy to understand. Like people can wrap their brain around that, but understanding that your brain also can be conditioned to um, weather these incidents and weather the experiences of law enforcement over a 30-year career, I think is we're still getting there. I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there that it's not recognized as I can do things. It doesn't mean that you're not going to experience them. It just might be that you're not sitting there going, I don't know what to do with this,
Right.
versus I being aware of how you're experiencing this. And it, it's a little bit like I wasn't intending on. going here, but I think there's some, my doctoral dissertation was all around the use of self in law
Mhm.
enforcement. And um, essentially by, if you were able to have a camera up above you watching how
Mhm.
things are going, how you're interacting, and how things are playing out, and being able to real time, being able to understand, like, how am I impacting this? Because you're, regardless of how objective you think you are, because you're there and
Mhm.
because you're involved in it, you're impacting the dynamic. And how do I try to first recognize that after the fact? What was my intent? What was I trying to accomplish here? What did I contribute to this dynamic? How did I contribute to this? And then, kind of training your brain to recognize that I can do this real time, and recognizing that I know that when I'm tired, stressed, when it's people that I trust, you're less likely to be your best self. And being able to recognize that if I try, it's in a trusting relationship, like with your spouse, your kids, that's usually where you're going to let down your guard, and because they're still going to be there, if that makes sense. This is where you're not behaving the way you hope to, the way how you're interacting with your spouse, how you're interacting with family members isn't how you hope to, or you're intended the way you want it to, but there's lower risk versus if I do that at a council meeting because I'm tired, or because we're doing union negotiations and I'm getting frustrated with the process. I'm
That
usually,
wouldn't be bad at all.
yes, that might have a negative impact. Like
Yeah,
the idea
right.
is that I'm better aware of, if I say this is going to have a worse outcome.
Yep.
And you manage that better when there's a little more risk involved of, this could go poorly if I say what I'm really thinking, or if I, sit off and I'm, arms crossed and, stomping around, whatever that looks like. But it's that awareness of, being able to do that real time to say, how do I want to impact this dynamic? And I think there's ways that you can practice that. All these things, we practice things. We do reality-based training in law enforcement. We do scenario training. We do all this stuff, and there's science behind why we do it. Like, you're creating those pathways of understanding. You're creating pathways of, I've experienced this before. I know how to do this. I've done these things. Why do we disconnect when it comes to wellness? It's an interesting dynamic that it's like, oh no, that's totally different. That doesn't make sense here, or I'm fine, I got this. It's the same thing. Like, apply the same logic to as you do with a brand new cop. We do scenarios with them. We do reality-based training. We do this stuff to try and create experiences that they can feed off of down the road, or feed, learn from. We can do that with mental health and and wellness in general as well.
I completely agree. And I think, to your point though, there's been great strides, even in the last 10 years of what
Yeah,
that looks like. And anyone who's listening to this podcast, they're gonna be like, oh my gosh, she says this all the time. But I just really, really, truly believe that there's three steps to growth, and it's awareness, education, and then action. And so I think, like, to your point, it's like, okay, how can you have that awareness? And that could be self-awareness, as you just explained. And I really
right.
like the bird's eye view of having that self-awareness of what is it that I'm doing, and taking that self accountability and reflection. I think that's really hard for a
Yep.
lot of people to do. It's hard for me to do that sometimes, to sit down
Mhm.
and be like, wow, like, what was my role in this? And how did I
Mhm.
react? And was that the best? Could I have done better? And I think that first step is awareness. And that could also be organizationally, like, what are the things that are the challenges? How can we take accountability or have some awareness as to what's going on internally? And then the second one's education. So once you have the awareness, now it's time to educate and see, okay, well, what are the things that we can put in place? What are the things that we can do to improve? And then the third one, which I think is oftentimes the hardest, is the actionary step. So, like, how can we then take action to make sure that there is that improvement? Because if there's no action, there's no real sense in doing anything at all, because then
Sure.
you're going to continue doing what you did before. So I think it's
Hmm.
awareness, education, and then action. I'm really curious to hear from you because, most agencies in the US are small agencies. And I
Right,
think maybe the public doesn't understand that or doesn't know that. It's not all these huge organizations.
right,
Most organizations are really small, and there's unique challenges that come with having a smaller, more tight-knit community, smaller, more tight-knit, a department. And I think, across the board, regardless of what size you are, there's this recruitment and retention challenge.
hmm,
And especially when you have a smaller agency, you can't really afford to lose people. You really want to keep people who are there for the long term. When we talk about longevity, do you see wellness as a recruitment and retention tool? And maybe what are some of the things that you've done, within your organization that have been successful to
sure.
create that culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a expectation of the work, and that might be geographic. But in Minnesota, it really has become an expectation that you do have some kind of wellness. And it is something that, it might not be top of the list necessarily when people are looking at employers, but I would promise that from a retention standpoint, it's going to be something that will help keep people engaged.
Mhm.
I think there's a couple barriers that are sometimes difficult to overcome, but ultimately where we allocate funds is where we're setting our priorities,
Mhm.
and when we can talk about it and say we support you, dot dot dot, I can put out emails, I can go to, tell people that we're supportive of them. But if I'm not allocating or advocating budget money to support these initiatives, it doesn't mean anything,
Right.
and there's going to be costs attached to this. And from a smaller department perspective, you know, I I haven't been able to figure out a way that we can staff and allow people to work out on duty. I don't have a facility for them to work out in. We're in a pole barn building essentially that doesn't have a workout facility. Our fire department doesn't have a workout facility. So, in we those type of hurdles, it's like, all right, well, then we started having conversations with SNAP in town here. Is there a way we could have a discounted, or corporate rate with them? Um, that still doesn't, I don't necessarily think it's a great idea for a cop to go on duty in Snap Fitness and work out. Like, I don't think the logistics of that work out, but is there a way we can create some kind of programming that supports them to do that? Um, and I just don't have that figured out yet. But I think there's opportunities there. From a physical wellness side of things, we've contracted with an organization that does cardiac screening every 3 years. So I take a third of the department, and every year I pay 100% of the cost of them doing this full comprehensive cardiac assessment. That's labs, that's, the metabolic testing. It's on the list. So they go do that. It's voluntary. They don't have to participate. I don't get the lab results. I don't get any of the results. I just, again, pay the bill, and it's up to them then to make a choice on what they want to do with that information. I'm hoping that they're following up with their primary care provider and taking steps necessary. But it also it's, one more thing to show like that, we're allocating funds to this. And, in a budget of, over 2 million bucks for the size of our department, if it costs me 3 grand a year to do that, okay. I think that's reasonable. It sends 3 to 4 people, and I can get that done every year. If I do it every 3 years, they want to do it more on their own, great. But I think at least I'm setting a baseline for them. And I started with the most senior, because I think, the idea is there that as the longer people are in this line of work, there might be more risk. So doing that has been successful. I've always had everyone participate, and we're going on our third year this year, if I remember correctly. That's been a really good initiative. Doing the annual, checkup from the neck up that I talked about earlier, the therapy sessions, brought in a financial planner that was familiar with kind of the police pensions and that type of thing. We're due to bring someone in again because we've hired, I think, 5 people in the last year. So bringing someone in just to, on the front end, so people feel, know how to prepare themselves for retirement, prepare themselves for being financially stable as time goes on. There's ways to do that, and if we're not addressing that, it can be very stressful as time goes on. So, being supportive of our chaplain corps, some people find that valuable and find that it's a good resource for them, and I want to make sure that they're available. It's a chaplain through our county sheriff that is available. So looking at this from a holistic perspective to say, all right, we want to cover as many of these things. Some of them are going to have costs, and honestly, I've had some discussions at our council meetings. Isn't this stuff covered by insurance already? Why are we paying for these things? And it's a good discussion point. And ultimately, I'll die on the hill that is different. It's different working in public works as it is for public safety. And I will, it's everyone has traumatic experiences. I understand that, but law enforcement and public safety, it is different. And it's a different benefit that I think we need to provide to people. And I just put it in place. I didn't have union discussions. I didn't have anything else. Just started doing it,
Mm.
um, and making that happen. Physical wellness is again a challenge. I've worked with the League of Minnesota Cities. I've worked with our city attorney in trying to come up with how do we set standards for every year that people, so making sure that there's physical wellness is in place has been really challenging. There's so much litigation around that and how to do it properly and how do you manage that if they're not able to meet the standard, then sent to their on light duty until they can be reconditioned and those type of things. So those are all things that are really difficult to work through in a
Yeah.
small department. I can't afford to take someone off the street for 2 months while they recondition in a gym that I don't have.
Right.
It's like I can't do that versus there's a suburb on the west side of the metro area that they can do that. They have a gym in their department, and they can set a standard that these are the benchmarks we're going to hit every year. And if you can't, we pull you off the street and we do reconditioning, and you have time to do that, and they can absorb that versus I can't. So I'm trying to find a balance there, how we can incentivize physical wellness as well, and just from a workplace injury reduction standpoint, and how do we minimize those injury on duty claims and all that stuff. It's like there's ways to do that. It's a really difficult. There's a lot of barriers in place that cause some challenges. So that's still a work in progress.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate your perspective and using the word holistic because I think that that's another one of those words that maybe still isn't fully accepted
Sure.
and gets like a little bit of an eye roll sometimes because of the stigma. But I completely agree with you that
Hmm.
there's so many different aspects to consider when it comes to wellness, and you touched on a lot of them. How do
Hmm.
we support physical, mental, financial, of course, nutritional,
Hmm.
and home wellness? We talked about that too. And I think
Sure.
that when you can look at wellness as multifaceted, and then you can start to, figure out how can you approach each element and make sure that everyone is supported in all the areas that you can.
Hmm.
I know that you're not alone. A lot of agencies I talk to struggle with the same type of challenge with having support and understanding that public safety is different.
Hmm.
And a lot of cities are like, well, if, we don't want to only provide something for
Right.
PD or fire, we want it to be across the board. And then you have, individuals like yourself who are like, advocating and fighting for it and like, hey, like it is different. And I've even had conversations where they're like, okay, like if you want it for everyone, great, like let's have it for everyone then, as long as we get it, like have
Perfect.
it for
Yeah.
everyone, like we don't
Right.
care, like but
Right.
then they're
Yeah.
like, well, now we can afford to have it for everybody
Right.
because now instead
Right.
of having 10 people at the PD, now we're trying to cover 150 people citywide
Correct.
or whatever. So
Right.
like now we don't have it in the general fund or whatever funding that you're pulling from. So
Right.
it is a challenge, and obviously I don't know the answer, but I love that you're like, I'll die on the hill and I'll, sit
Yeah.
here and advocate as much as I can to make sure my people are supported. And
Yeah.
I really like that you said, because I've never heard this before. You said where we allocate funds is where we're setting our priorities. I think that
Yeah.
that is a really well said statement.
Yeah. It's um an artifact of what your priorities are and what your strategy is. It's a way of showing that this is a priority. And, it's ultimately by taking off one bite at a time, it is achievable and it doesn't become this gigantic. And I can't do all the things.
Mhm.
I can't, like I said, I can't pay them to work out right now. I can't, I can't build a fitness facility in our garage.
Yeah.
I can't do those things, but how can I try to make incremental steps towards that? Fast forward, if we get a new facility, and my council overall is super supportive. They've been really supportive of these initiatives, and it's not a thing. That doesn't mean that I don't have some discussion though about what does this look like.
Right.
But as we look at new facilities down the road, it's by showing that these things are a priority. Um, how do then that needs to be part of the facility as well. As you have to build these things in order to make it workable. And I really think they'll be used. It's just a matter of we have to demonstrate that there's a commitment up to this point. And if I can show that our mental health initiatives are being used, if I can show that, the things that I have in place are being utilized when we're looking at facilities down the road, and it's, what do you mean you need a gym? What do you mean? Why do we have to provide space for this? Well, these are the reasons why. And it's a long process, but I'm hopeful we'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one thing that popped in my head when you were saying that, because you said like one bite at a time. Have you ever heard the
Mhm.
question where they say, "How do you eat an elephant?"
Right. Yeah. That's
That's
exactly.
what,
Yeah.
that's what I thought
Right.
of. I was like, "Yep, like
Yeah.
this is a big elephant, and one
Yeah.
bite at a time, one step at a
Yeah.
time."
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
and I think, eventually my hope is that, every agency across the country has all the resources that they need to thrive and to support their people. And I think that we'll get there. I think that it's like you
Mhm.
said, it's a slow moving ship, but I think that, it's already made some leeway. So
Yeah.
just, keep advocating and keep having the discussions. And, my hope is that in the next 10 years, everyone will feel like they have the resources that they need. I wanted to ask you one final question before we
Sure.
end. What words of wisdom would you give to someone who's earlier in their career when it comes to wellness? Maybe something that you wish you would have known, or a piece of advice you wish you would have listened to, or something that's helped you along the way.
Yeah, I think, there's as these resources become more available and we have a better awareness of, we know that these things will help, taking advantage of them and trying it out. I think that eh, there doesn't need to be this stigma attached anymore. I think if after you're exposed to an incident or after you've been through something, if something feels off, your body's telling you something to say, you're right, this is off. This isn't normal. I shouldn't have to see these things. I shouldn't have to feel fear at work. I shouldn't have to be the target of an assault. I shouldn't, that's all true. However, it is the reality.
Mhm.
And there's resources in place. There are a million different, you know, nonprofit organizations. And it doesn't even have to be department sponsored, but there are resources available. Um, and I think that it's just a matter of trying it out. And if it's not, if the first therapist you go to isn't the right one, try somebody else. And I think there's resources available. It's just a matter of making sure that you are taking advantage of them and not being ashamed to do so.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on here
Yeah,
and
of course.
talking with me. I wanted to maybe just leave the floor to you if there's anything else we missed, if you want to add anything, but that's all I have for you for today. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think, we're a department of 10 cops, 8,200 people in our city. I've got a very supportive, council, and it's just been, you have to start somewhere. And I was just teaching the mentoring coaching this week or last week, and, I have departments that are just like, where do I start? What's the first thing? And share information. There's other departments out there that are doing this stuff. Um, it's accessible, and we have to be able to share this information and start on one thing. It doesn't cost you anything to bring in a financial planner. It doesn't cost you anything to have someone come in and talk about their experiences with art therapy. There's ways you can get this going without having a huge expense, and then start building it in your budget as time goes on. And I think it's achievable.
I agree. And I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for coming on today's episode.
Excellent. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.